Welcome to Mercer County Community College, where we are all about learning and student success. So appropriate. My normal welcome is so appropriate for the content and topic that we're going to be looking at today. But we are delighted to have you here on our campus. Most of you know me. I'm Pat Donahue, the president of Mercer County Community College, and also currently serving as chair of the presidents. So we appreciate you being here. We know other trustees will be joining us as the traffic and their schedule allow. On behalf of our board chair, Wendy Harris, who will be joining us, welcome. I'd like to acknowledge that Mercer's trustees already here, more expected. The vice chair, Shamil Rodriguez, Anthony Inverso, and Laura Morana. Some of you were there with us about 5 years ago when we had that first big brainstorming session about what's the future going to look like? How do we make our colleges sustainable for the future? How do we make sure that we're focused and targeted and honed in on really making the students who show up at our doors successful learners, because we have to continue to be there as the point of access where people can create and build their dreams. There's been a lot of work since that very first conference when we did that, but out of that came the 8 big ideas. And we're not going to talk about all 8 of them today. You've heard a lot of reports over time, but the first 3 of those big ideas have a lot to do with the topic we're looking at today, and which most of us are looking at on our campuses at our board meetings, as well as in our administration and our faculty planning. The first big idea was about improving remedial education, finding a way to help our least prepared students become successful learners and qualified to enter into college-level work and then degree completion. We are working on that on every campus. The second of those big ideas was about aligning better with K-12, the planning work we can do with our partners, the superintendents and the high school principals and faculty, in how we move the students coming through their curriculum to a better state of preparedness and alignment to enter the college. Most of you know we have college readiness going on this spring and this summer with some federal support. Larry's probably going to talk about that. But the third part that you as trustees have looked at several times is the student success model. And our officers and others together worked through the process of how do we measure success. We don't have the perfect answer yet. I don't expect to see it for a long time. But we know that counting diplomas, counting degrees granted, is not the only measure for the success we provide for our students. So with a lot of work looking at VFA, the voluntary framework of accountability, of looking at achieving the dream, we created our own student success model. We've already revised it once, making it more extensive, but we wanted to make sure that it accounts for where are our students when they enter. Does how long we have to track them and what we have to do make a difference because of what their preparation was coming in? And how many of those are completing developmental work? That's a big success for those students. How many of them complete 1 semester or 1 year towards their associate degree? That's a big success for those students. And when we're having conversations with the legislature, with our public, and with those people who are thinking about performance funding formulas, we need to make sure that we have all of the right measures of success in that discussion. Those are the first 3 of the big 8 of the big ideas, the 8 big ideas, and they really drive the discussion we're having now. We had student affairs officers and some faculty and academics here today working with our speaker, working on this very same topic, sort of at a what we're going to do in the trenches level. So we're glad Rob is here. We thank you for doing both presentations, both parts of today. And again, I welcome you all here. It is now my pleasure and privilege to introduce the chair of the New Jersey Council of County Colleges, Bakari Lee.
On behalf of the council for attending, looking forward to this trustee retreat and the presentation that we are going to hear from Dr. Rob Johnstone. Had a brief opportunity to speak to Dr. Johnstone during an executive committee conference call about a month or so ago, and I have to say I was really impressed with his thoughts and ideas with respect to how he would present in the areas of student success and what he would be able to bring to the table for us here at the council. I also had a chance to kind of mill around a little bit, talk to some of my colleagues from my school at Hudson County Community College, and I must say, Rob, they were effusive with praise about what you presented today, and your ability to communicate the ideas that you have in this area, and to be a thought leader in the area. And they were also very effusive in their praise about your ability to be a lively speaker and kind of keep everything going. So I hope that doesn't kind of put too many expectations on you, but
build it up a little more.
And so we look forward to your presentation. Look forward to seeing you be able to levitate as you speak. Clearly, we've heard this notion of student success over and over from the President, Barack Obama, first speaking to this area, comments I believe that he made at Macomb Community College in 2009 through now. He's consistently been very supportive of community colleges. He's called community colleges the cornerstone of the American education system. Obviously, I recognize that I'm speaking to the choir, preaching to the choir, but that notwithstanding, I think that it is critical not only for CEOs and administrators in general to be knowledgeable in this area. It's also critically important for trustees to be knowledgeable in this area as well, so that we can develop a realistic set of expectations about the world as it is now, and then be able to marry that with a path toward achieving the goal that we're all looking forward to achieve, which is to kind of move the needle from being access institutions to access to success institutions, and that's really the goal. And the only way to make that happen is to understand the world, understand what that means, and then be able to build a governance structure that allows that to take place. And to that end, the last thing that I'll mention is it has been a mantra of mine toward trustees that it's critical that we work hand in glove with our presidents. We have to empower our presidents to be creative, to be courageous and creative in this area, to be supportive of all of the goals and initiatives that we have towards student success. If presidents are not properly incentivized to take this on and move forward with it and be bold and daring, then it's not going to happen. And the way to incentivize them is to put them in a position of security on this topic, that we all understand sometimes the grave nature of the numbers, that we're willing to go in with our eyes wide open, manage these issues, and then chart a new path that takes the paradigm shift, the cultural shift that we're all experiencing into consideration. So toward that end, the council staff have touched base with Dr. Johnstone, and we look forward to hearing their remarks. With that, I'll turn it over to our Executive Director and President, Dr. Larry.
I'll do just a quick couple of thank yous. First to our trustees here tonight. Well, we are so grateful for what you do as trustees. Trusteeship is a uniquely American invention, I believe, in terms of governing colleges, and this might be useful context for for Dr. Johnstone as well, you enjoy responsibilities far greater than most trustees in most states. Rob, New Jersey reorganized its higher education system now about 20 years ago, and so these trustees have a great authority locally to set tuition, to approve new programs, and yes, we hope advance student success initiatives as well. So that's a really good thing, and a special bragging on Bakari. Bakari is a terrific trustee at one of our colleges, Hudson, and the vice chair, but he was recently elected, we want you to know, many of you probably know it, to the executive committee of the National Trustee Association, known as ACCT, the Association of Community College Trustees, and that puts him on a pathway to chair that national organization in a couple of years. So we're eager for that. Well, we don't want to wish time to pass too quickly. I was going to say we're eager for that day, but we'll be patient and look forward to supporting him on that pathway. A big deal in our community college world to chair the National Community College Trustee Organization. And to President Donahue and Mercer's trustees, thank you for hosting us. We're really blessed as well with 19 terrific community college presidents, and each year they elect one of their 19 to chair the president's component of our combined state organization. And Dr. Donahue, colleague and friend, mentor to many of our gang, has just been such a delight to work with. You know, Mercer trustees, and where are you? You keep her pretty busy, we know that. But boy, we're so grateful for her taking time to lead our statewide initiatives. You know, like Bakari, she's a national community college leader. She's led community colleges in my native state, Pennsylvania, in St. Louis, but now, happily for us, doing great work here in New Jersey at Mercer County Community College. And I said this morning playfully, I'm not complaining about this, but there have been recent weeks where, you know, I'll get a 10, 11 p.m. call from Dr. Donahue, and then the next morning I'll get a call at 7. Gee, Pat, we just talked, didn't we? Well, we welcome that, and she's just been a great leader for our sector. So, to Dr. Johnstone, Rob, if we can call him Rob. Listen, we've all met high energy people, but based on the last 6 hours, Rob had the pleasure and privilege of spending those 6 hours with about 200 of your faculty and deans and vice presidents, and I'm going to continue to set the bar high here. And he was just remarkable, high energy, spot on with the messages about student success. So let me just get out of the way so you can enjoy this same kind of excitement about, as Bakari put it, access is important, but we're now focusing more on student success, and so let's hear how better to do that for trustees, for presidents both. Dr. Rob Johnstone.
I could actually spend, Bakari, 90 minutes talking about the issue you raised briefly in your comments about the role of trustees in hiring presidents who feel free to innovate and be thought leaders at their campus. And I would argue pretty strongly that historically, those haven't been the characteristics we've looked for in presidents. And I actually think this is a huge issue as we move forward into a new world order where colleges are held more accountable to improving outcomes of rigor and authentically producing more graduates who can, you know, fuel the workplace and the economic engine that President Obama and many people think the community colleges are. I think we could have a really interesting discussion about that for about 90 minutes, but I do think that's an incredibly important role of trustees, and also a role in helping shepherd the student success conversation we're going to talk about a little bit today. So how many, most of you trustees, we have a couple presidents in the room? Who are the presidents in the room? We have, okay, well, we got about half and a half. So tell me, trustees, real quickly, and I'll introduce myself a little more in a second. What are some of your day jobs? Like, what are the things you do outside of your role as trustees?
Attorney.
Attorney, what else? What do you do? Yeah, you.
Do I have an outside job?
Yeah.
Besides my trustee?
Yeah.
That was a joke.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Financial advisor.
Financial advisor.
Text messages from me.
Exactly, financial advisor. What are some of the other industries?
Executive County Superintendent.
Oh, great.
K
K through 12. Any others out there? Yeah.
Professional staff.
Okay, cool. Cool. What about you?
Retired.
Retired. That's a good one. I like that one. It's interesting because one of the things, and actually I'm going to do 4 presentations today. This will be the third of 4. The fourth, we left the best for last. It's the cost discussion, the last of 4 discussions after dinner. That'll be perfect for that. But I actually find really interesting when we start talking about what I call the economics of innovation, this idea that when we start thinking about doing things differently, we got to think about what does this cost and what's the return on it. I often find trustees the most receptive audience to this conversation because you do it in your day-to-day lives. Right? You're used to thinking like a business person because, frankly, you're most often in business, right? And we have this issue in higher ed sometimes that we don't often think like folks in industry think. So my background, real quickly, I have a doctorate in social psychology from the University of Oregon. Actually, psychology and the law, jury decision making was my doctoral research. I joked about this morning. I was doing research on race and the death penalty in the mid-1990s, doing mock jury trials. Anyone think of what was going on in the jury system in the mid-1990s? OJ, that's right. That literally during that 18 months where that was tell Nancy Grace there was never more interest in the legal system, and we can do 90 minutes on Nancy Grace too. But there was never more interest in the legal system than during that 18 months. And so I was studying the jury system at a time when never have the issues of race and the criminal jury system been more in focus. And so I actually went to industry after that, and I served for about 7 years as a strategic consultant in industry, working for boutique consulting firms, largely around what we called the data explosion. This was the late 1990s when all the data that we were able to get, it started in the database marketing world, and every company had data on their customers. This idea of how do you use that data to manage the customer relationship, to manage the customer life cycle. I spent a lot of time helping companies figure out how to use their data in authentic ways. And but you guys as trustees will appreciate this. I had great timing. I joined an internet consulting firm in July of 2000. Which you may remember the timing on that. So I joined a consulting firm that had 2,700 consultants in 26 cities when I joined. 14 months later, we had 170 in 3 cities. And I was Norm from Cheers. So my job after the first 4 months when they realized this is not going anywhere good, I got to go and literally close offices and fire people. And after round 4 of the layoffs, I'm like, will you please lay me off? Somebody lay me off. They said, no, we like you. You lay people off very well. I'm like, great. So after that experience, I got out. I actually left the field and landed in higher education, this crazy field known as institutional research, which I didn't know anything about. I didn't know that there was a field that existed. Essentially, what I saw it as was being an internal strategic consultant at a college. The idea, we have these really tough questions about student success and other issues. We've got a data set, and we got a bunch of people who don't know a lot about data, and we need to marry these things to create a culture. And by the way, this presentation today will not be about data, so you don't need to worry about that. We're going to talk about how we use data, but this culture, this kind of a fascinating niche, and I happened to land at a really great college in California, Foothill, and worked there for 3 years as a dean of institutional research. And then through a series of events I explained as a Tom Clancy novel, I ended up as the provost/vice president of instruction 3 years later. It's like the first 5 people to line of the succession get knocked off, and you're in 6th in line, and all of a sudden you're the secretary of the interior and you're the president. That's kind of what happened without the death part. But I served as VP of instruction for 3 years, and during this whole time I've been doing this kind of consulting in higher education as well. Started around the kind of use of data, but in the last 5 years it's really evolved into how do colleges change the conditions for student success and do this at scaled levels? So I've worked on most of the major national initiatives in this space, including Achieving the Dream, Completion by Design, which I'll talk a little bit about today, a project that's really focused on changing the structures that our students go through and we put in front of students. I've worked with the Carnegie Foundation, Statway, Quantway. I've worked with the Education Trust. And so I've had the opportunity with a great bunch of colleagues and peers to see a lot of what's gone on around the country. So I'll infuse into the discussion both this afternoon and this evening a huge sense of optimism that we actually can change this. Can create the conditions so that many more of our students graduate with degrees and certificates of value. This is not an impossible task. It's not going to be easy, but I can share with you places that have done it and that we see graduation rates in the 60s and 70s rather than the 30s and 40s. And there's just a lot to learn from the stuff that's gone on around the country. I also got to serve You may have heard of the Aspen Prize for Community College Excellence. I ran the site visits for all the finalists for the Aspen Prize, so I've seen the top 10 schools for each of the last 2 years and been involved in the process that's helped select those. We're actually just starting again right now. And it's been fast. We do these fascinating 2-day site visits at these top colleges. And again, you can debate the methodology of how the data is used to get people into the top 120. You know, we don't have great data sets nationally. We have to use iPads because we don't have a lot of other options. And so there are some limitations. But when you get down to this final 10, these are 10 pretty good colleges. Whether they're the best in the country is debatable. But we've learned a lot from these colleges too, and I'll kind of fold that into the discussion as well. This is going to be, after I do this little soliloquy, a discussion. We're going to have lots of conversation about this. I want to hear what you think about this stuff. And I think at the end of this, we're going to have about 90 minutes. You may come out with just a different view of what it means to focus on student success and to use data in community colleges. I think it's a really important frame that we're going to get to. So I have somewhere up here a clicker. All right. So I just some quick acknowledgments. I've worked on all these great, crazy national projects with a great bunch of partners. My friends at the Community College Research Center right up the road here at Teachers College at Columbia, Davis Jenkins and the team. Wonderful. Very commonly, by the way, there are lots of outside research firms who have opinions about the community college sector, lob bombs over the fence at community college sector, who've never stepped foot on a community college campus. Lots of people have opinions about what community colleges should do without knowing the reality of what it's like on the ground. And this resonates a lot with those practitioners I was with last time. I've lived in community colleges. I know what it's like on the ground. The folks at CCRC do as well. While not having been on the ground, they create research that we actually can use and learn from in the real world. It's a really important frame. A bunch of other great organizations. And I also think that one of the things when I talk about data that I share with practitioners that's really important is the way you present data is critically important to it actually being understood and used. I don't know how many of you love seeing 30 pages of spreadsheets that give data to you in a way at a board meeting, but most of you, if you see that, are probably not excited when you get to see those spreadsheets. And it's pretty, even though when you're in the business world you deal with that kind of way of getting data a lot, it doesn't immediately spring into these conclusions you can reach and the insight you generate from this data. So I actually really think the graphic side of data is really important. So we'll talk about that a little bit. But I want to start with this. I want to get your reaction to what I call formalistic doublespeak, which is I'm going to give you a list of 10 words that are commonly used in our system and in your world. And I want you to kind of give your first reaction to these words. Accountability, accreditation, assessment, continuous improvement, data-driven decision-making, evaluation, key performance indicators, logic model, performance-based funding, and strategic planning. Does anyone get really excited by these words? Does anyone actually get really excited by these words? Because I'm curious. All right, I've got one. Which one? Which one do you like?
Assessment.
Okay, cool. That's actually one of the softer ones on here, actually. But my point about this is, this, by the way, is what we've been telling community college practitioners and leaders. This is what you should be doing. You should be doing what's kind of is kind of contained by these 10 words. By the way, your first reaction to this is no different than faculty's first reaction to this, administrators' first reaction to this, and dean's first reaction to this. And for the most part, and I'll make this point in a minute, these words have been used as weapons. And assessment's a good one, by the way. Assessment done well helps us figure out how well we're doing at producing learning. Assessment done poorly or done formalistically often leads to the opposite effect, right? And one of my favorite ones in here is this term data-driven decision-making, to which I would share the observation that no piece of data in the history of time has ever made a decision. This sounds like a trivial concept. People make decisions, and hopefully we want them to reflect upon data, have the right data they need, they reflect upon it, generate some insight from it, and then act on it. But all of those are stages in a process that, frankly, we don't often go through. We hand people data and assume that the data is going to tell them what to do. I could give you one of those spreadsheets, and I'll actually show you some data. I'm going to show you some data from real-world data that I've collected that I think makes a really important point about how we look at data. We're going to have 25, 30 different interpretations of what's creating that data and what we should do about it, and too often, we don't have discussions about that. It's in the 25 heads in the room, probably some pretty good thoughts. We don't get together to talk about what do you think's going on here? What do you think we should do about it? Those are not conversations that happen as a matter of course in board meetings or on the campuses. Right, this is where you have this unique role of being able to change the discussions. I got to tell you, I was not excited when I had to go to the board meetings at my old campus. Right? Because to me, they weren't about student success. They were about process and about what I would call feeding the machine. And so you guys own the ability to change that in many ways, to change the nature of Bakari, what you were talking about, change the nature of the conversation. What do you want to talk about at board meetings? And again, we can talk about some of this today, but I think and again, the colleges have to run. We have to do what we need to do to make colleges efficient and to have the finances we need to run colleges. But there's a whole question about why we're doing those things. Are we focused on efficiency, productivity, and enrollment for its own end? Or are we focused on those as a tool so we can actually change the conditions and do things differently to produce higher levels of success? And so again, coming back to these, for the most part, you get vivid imagery from the previous slide. Your average faculty member, when they see those words, gets a nervous tick on their forehead because for the most part, there's nothing positive for them in those words. They've literally been beaten over the head with these phrases in the last 10 years, right? Everything is supposed to be about those 10 phrases. And they're, by the way, fairly correct to analyze it. For the most part, we've gone down this path and nothing's really gotten that much better, right? And I would argue that the more formal the process has been, in many cases, the less likely you're going to get the authentic discussions around improvement that you really want. Not necessarily 100% correlation there, but the more formalistic we've made this, the less likely you are to have the conversations. One of my favorite stories on this one is an Aspen Prize co-winner this year, Santa Barbara City College in Santa Barbara, California. It's easy to write off Santa Barbara as a really rich college on a hill overlooking the ocean because it's a really rich college on a hill overlooking the ocean. Makes it easier to do that. But they're actually a very interesting college. They're a Hispanic serving institution. They serve over 33% of their students are low-income Latino students from the area, and they do better by those students than nearly any college in the country. But Santa Barbara has this story. So they were one of the early leaders in California in the learning outcomes assessment movement. So this notion of assessment, authentic assessment that they're really using for improvement. And so we did this site visit there a couple of years ago for the prize. And we were talking to their folks about this assessment model they had, this really kind of ingenious, deep assessment model where they got together and talked about it. And like, so tell us what's happened with this in the 2 years since we did this report on it. And they're like, oh, we had to stop doing that. What do you mean you had to stop doing that? They said, well, we had an accreditation visit 2 years later, and we had to redo everything we did authentically to fit it into the formalistic model that accreditation required. They literally stopped doing what they... Now, I don't, by the way, I'm not railing against accreditors here. Accreditors have a job to do. But one of the things I would say that's happened, especially in the assessment movement, is the more formal they've made the requirement of learning outcomes and the process you have to go through to achieve them, the less likely it's actually led to anything real on the ground. We had a statement from one of our accreditors, by the way, that said, you, faculty, need to assess every learning outcome in every class, every semester, and use the results to improve your classrooms. We had a faculty member who's, we have some interesting faculty members, as do all colleges. We had a faculty member who said, all right, I'll try that one semester. He literally took all his learning outcomes and picked an assessment paradigm, collected data on it, analyzed the data. First of all, he said it took him an average of 10 hours extra a week. And at the end of it, he was only able to add a question or two per exam that he used to assess the learning. Like the idea that this is just can become a ritualistic thing, this model we're talking about creating for faculty is almost the opposite of what we really want them to do, is pick some piece of what you're trying to do and trying to get better at, research it, try something different, see how it works, learn from it, and move it forward. My friends at Valencia College down in Orlando, who was the first winner of the Aspen Prize, they're well known for a lot of things, very justified winner of the prize. But one of the things they do is their tenure process is different than it is at other schools. Every first-time full-time faculty member there knows before they get there that they are going to do a research project on student learning in their classroom. And they're going to try something different, and they're going to collect data, and they are going to share the results in a peer forum at the end of the year that is attended by everyone on campus. They've been doing this for 12 years. So they have a cadre of 300 some full-time faculty who were brought in and told part of what it is to be a faculty is to try to get better at what you do. And by the way, this tenure process was asked for by the faculty, not by the administration. And so there is an authentic process, right? They've built it into the structure. So over time, they know a lot more about student learning than anyone else. I don't think it's an accident that they're a winner of the Aspen Prize and their success rates are that much higher. They've done a lot of other things with it too. One of the first things their president did, we'll get to this point later, when he came to the campus, Sandy Shugart, is he actually got rid of the enrollment report. He said, we're not doing the enrollment report anymore on this campus. I and my colleagues will do this in the back office. You guys worry about student success. Does the enrollment report really need to be the thing that everyone on the campus is galvanized around? Yeah, it's important for budgeting, but is that actually the right answer for how to improve student success? And we'll hop into this a little later too. I'd say there's good news here for our improvement efforts. You can do all the things captured by those words in more authentic and less formalistic ways. And I would argue that this is about changing the conversation. We have to make the conversation about things that, by the way, you, as well as faculty, staff, and administrators care about, which is students, their learning, and improving their outcomes in lives, right? That's why you're here. It's why most of you are here. It's why most of any group that exists in the system are here. It's certainly not for the riches and wages of being involved in the community college system. People are here because they care about this stuff. They believe, as do much of the research suggests, that this is the economic engine to the middle class for vast numbers of our students. What middle class still exists is what the community college actually is engendering. So this idea, if we can change the conversation to these things, people will come on. You can feed all of those machines that you have to, but if you change the conversation for faculty, staff, and administrators, and by the way, I'd argue for you guys at board meetings, you change those conversations, you can do all those things and have a very different conversation about the outcomes. Here's my other thing about this. Not everyone will come along. We don't actually need everyone to come along. And so this is something that I ran into a couple of years ago in California, a model of organizational change. It's kind of hokey. We call it the red light, yellow light, green light model. And so this idea is that whenever you are thinking about any type of change in an organization, there's three types of people in the world. There's green light people who are there with you before you had the idea. They're the innovators or the early adopters or the ones at the cutting edge. Doesn't matter what your idea is, if it's new, they're on board, right? Then you have the red light people who, if shown data that the way they're doing it results in a 5% success rate and the other way of doing it results in a 95% success rate, are never going to change no matter what you do. Right? They're resistant to any sort of change. They are generally folks who are not going to move off their current structure. And then there's this yellow light group in the middle who would argue, it's just a theory, this is a bell curve. You got lots of yellow light people who are willing to be swayed either way, right? They could come to the side of being innovative, or they could come to the side of being, kind of recalcitrant and overly afraid of change. And so what I thought was really interesting is the person who was talking about this said, we actually too much try to do one of two things. We either try to create more green light people, right, which is we need more people who are like our top 10% who are crazy early adopters, or we try to convince the red light people to come along. Neither one of those is that useful of a technique, right? The green light, you're not going to create that many people. There are just certain people who are going to be early adopters and certain who aren't. And there are certain people who are not going to change no matter what you do. The key is the middle. And every one of the colleges that you guys are trustees for, or presidents for, has most of the people in the middle. And you got to think about how change goes on your campus. Yeah, you need some green light people to kind of pave the way, show what's possible. But you're not trying to create more of them. You're trying to bring the middle along. That's where the leverage is. The leverage in any organization is to move the middle over by 10% rather than move the top by more than a couple percent. And so the red light people, yeah, if you wait for the red light people to come along, you're never going anywhere. They're not going to come along. You guys know who those people are on your campuses. I'm sure they're presenting in front of you at times or speaking out at board meetings saying, we can't change this, we've always done it this way. That sound familiar to any of you? We've always done it this way argument? Yeah, well, I'll come back to the we've always done it this way argument. I have some thoughts about that one. So it's a little bit hokey, but I and many practitioners have found this really useful because one of the problems is the leaders on your campus, whether they're presidents, VPs, deans, or faculty leaders, are running into trying to convince the red lighters to come along or trying to create more green lighters. And this idea is, what do we do for the people in the middle? How do we bring them along? I think it's a pretty important idea. The other thing people need is they need to see their expertise acknowledged and integrated. If you're going to ask people to come to the table and ask what they think about what you should do, you need to listen to them, acknowledge that they have some expertise, and try to integrate what they've told you into a process of moving forward. Faculty and staff especially are not used to being asked, what do you think we should do? What do you think's going on here, and what do you think we should do? Those are pretty important questions. They have by the way, the faculty and staff are the ones who see more students than we do. Even if you're a president or a vice president like I was, we don't see a lot. We only see students where there's a significant problem or things have gone significantly well. Right? We don't see a lot of the rank and file on a day-to-day basis. The faculty do, the student services folks do. I'm going to ask a question later, like what are the biggest barriers to student progress towards completion? You know who knows those? Your student services people on the front lines and your faculty in the classroom. We know that too from our history. But this is a pretty important piece. And so I want to do two things with this next slide. One is I'm going to make a point about how we use data, but I'm going to actually start with this. Let's think about what it takes for a student to complete at your college. So we're going to take a successful student and follow his or her path towards completion. So maybe we'll look at first-time students instead of returning students. By the way, I said this earlier, one of my roles I had on my earlier campus when I got there in the early 2000s, they referred to me as the Mythbuster. That was when the show Mythbusters came out, and there was this idea, there are all these widely held beliefs about our students that we had on our campuses that if you actually looked at the data were completely and totally untrue. A couple of my favorite ones are, students shouldn't take more units, they'll be unsuccessful if they'll do. If you ever look at the data on this, you know who the most successful group is on any community college campus? Students taking 18 or more units. Now this is a cause-effect thing, right? We're not going to counsel everyone to take 18 or more units. But this idea that the units actually correlates is the driver, how many units they take, is ludicrous. It's actually completely untrue in the data. And we often, by the way, where this becomes more of a problem is when we tell students 12 units is full-time. Yeah, for financial aid purposes, 12 units is full-time. You want to graduate on time? You're not graduating taking 12 units a semester, even if you're successful in all of them, right? That's 2.5 years at a minimum if you do it that way. And again, you're not going to pass all your classes. You're starting to talk 3.5 years. Your average time to degree, I'm sure, if you're like most of us in the community college system, is 3.5 or 4 years, right? There's lots of reasons for that. Dev ed, probably unstructured pathways, students not knowing what their progress is. But one of them also is we've told people 12 units is full time, when in fact it's not. So there's one issue. So if I we'll look at first time students for a second. Maybe they join a learning community. Maybe there's some other things going on along their pathway. And part of the point on the data side of this is one of the things we often do is we say, okay, we've got a 40% completion rate here at Rob Johnstone Community College, and we're going to make it 50 in 5 years. That type of thing sounds familiar. We all do this type of thing. Presidents do this all the time. The problem is it's not a bad idea to do this, to set goals and try to move them, but your practitioners, the folks on the ground, they sit in whatever meeting you say that, then they go back to their office and they say, what's my role in doing anything about this? This is a 30,000-foot metric. It's summative over a long, long period of time. How is what I do in a classroom relevant to what goes on at a 30,000-foot metric? So part of this story is also about unpacking the data down into its component pieces. But when I'm briefly talking about what it takes a student to navigate our college, here's what the world looks like, more like to one of our students. It's a random walk that's completely dissociated from anything that's intentional. And if you don't think it's this complicated, pull some transcripts sometime. And then try to ask students about what path they took to get into the institution and get through it. It is this chaotic. There's lots of national research on this. There's folks from CCRC have referred to navigating the community college system as like being in a canoe at night on a shapeless river with no moon. That's what we've made this like, navigating our colleges. And if, again, we didn't do this intentionally, right? We didn't set out to create a complicated system, but how many courses do your colleges have? 1,200? 1,400 courses? How many degree programs do you have? 80, 120? How do students find out about the relationship between courses and degrees? Most of our colleges, we give them exactly one thing. What's that? The catalog. When you're bored sometime, and I'm sure as trustees with a day job and being a trustee, you're often sitting around bored, open up the catalog to the page that starts listing your degree programs and read it through to the page that stops listing them and tell me how useful that is as a choice mechanism. It's a legal document. It's only there to categorize your, and we think that students are going to somehow figure out from such a document what they should major in, what the career options are after that, how many courses they're going to have to take, all the availability. We've made it this complicated for them. And by the way, we actually, when we had this, working with Miami-Dade College, Completion by Design, great college, they were when we were talking about restructuring student programs, they were struggling a little with this concept of limiting choice and adding structure. And so they actually had 28 faculty come into a room, one from each of the departments. They asked the biology faculty to leave the room, and they asked the other 27 faculty, so why don't you go ahead and design the ideal course sequence and pathway for a student who wants to graduate in biology using only the catalog? And they couldn't do it. Faculty at the college could not do it after 3.5 hours. It is that complicated. It is that complicated to navigate our structure. So part of this story is about what do we do to make things more streamlined for students. It's not hand-holding, it's not moving them along, it's just putting options in front of folks clearly. But one of my points about this slide is there's lots of stuff we can study down at this level that's going to have an impact on this overall number. You don't do studies at this level that say we're going to improve completion by X, because there is no X, right? There's lots of things that go into improving it that exist down at this level, right? You don't try to solve an overall profit company discussion at a business with one thing. You think about segments of customers. You think about what do you do for different segments? How do we serve these segments? Where's the profit? You think about things in terms of segmentation. So, by the way, one of my math faculty who saw this slide back in California said, you know, that's really great at showing us how chaotic the student pathway is, but it's still linear. The actual student pathway goes back on itself as circular. We tried to draw that. It didn't work, by the way. It looked like a Rorschach test. The world is both this complicated for our student, and again, where we have to focus our energies about answering key questions are things down at this level. So what are some of those things we want to focus our energy on? So I'm not going to get all frameworky on you at 3:40 in the afternoon. Most guys in Hawaii insurance don't get frameworky anyway. We don't even know what the word frameworky means. But we talk about this concept of a culture of inquiry. So I talked a little bit earlier about the point that data doesn't make decisions. So this concept, by the way, sounds like something the weird guy in the Hawaiian shirt in California is new agey kind of idea. What's a culture of inquiry? We've been working on, quote unquote, a culture of evidence for the last 10 years, right, in community colleges. And so the focus has been on, when you talk about a culture of evidence, what's the focus on? Data, right? It's about the data. Okay, that's an interesting concept. So again, it's this idea, and by the way, you guys who were in industry in the late 90s know this. This idea, that came around in the mid 90s was data will set us free. The data is all, if we just had the data, everything is going to be rosy, right? We're going to all magically figure out what to do with it, and it's going to be great. So one of the things I used to do in the last couple of years of my strategic consulting industry is everyone wanted a dashboard. This was the dashboard explosion. So every company wanted a dashboard of their key performance indicators. And so, by the way, there's nothing wrong with dashboards. Dashboards can be great. But I was the guy sitting in the back of the room, like the late 20s PhD guy, going, so let me get this straight. You're going to put these dashboards in. What's going to change after you put the dashboard in? What are people going to do differently now that they have access to this data? So there was an uncomfortable silence at that point, and after a while, my company told me to shut up because we were making $500,000 on this project. And the people on the other end said, we want a dashboard. Okay, well, that's an interesting way of thinking about this. So what happened a lot in industry at this time is, let's just say there was 100 people in an organization who had access to data before. Only 5 of them were power users. If you didn't pay attention to these process issues, after you put the dashboard in, the same 100 people, 5 people were power users who had nice graphical data in a graphical format with nice charts. The other 95 still didn't use it. Because we didn't change the business processes around it. We didn't change anything that asked folks, what are they going to do differently with this data? How are we going to ask them to use this data? And we as leaders, and by the way, this is a key role for you as trustees, asking questions about student success that actually use the data. How are we using this data? It's not an automatic translation to having it, to using it. And so I think this is, to me, what makes a culture of inquiry different is there's a dialogue where we actually have to get together and talk about the data. We're going to do this in a couple minutes. We're actually going to show you some data and talk about it. That's actually focused on strengthening outcomes, right? Here's the second part of this, that the data we're talking about is focused on outcomes. We'll come back to this point. So what are some features of a culture of inquiry? Widespread access to user-friendly information on student outcomes. User-friendly is a pretty key feature here, right? You guys probably have lots of data that comes across your trustee dockets, much of which is not very user-friendly and maybe not very comprehensible or usable. Right? So part of this is about what's the type of information we ask for. Another part of this is about student outcomes. Encouraging people to ask a wider collection of questions, actually use their evidence to enhance decision making. I'll come back to this a little later. The fact that we actually have dynamic discussions across constituency groups. This data I'm going to show you, which is about student success in gen ed courses. The key epiphany in this room that I was presenting to of about 120 faculty and staff came from the lowest paid person in the room. It was a financial aid tech one who was probably making $18,000. She had the temerity, which was awesome, to raise her hand in the back and say, that's great, Rob, but what about this? And she had the key epiphany. And the point here is we tend to assume dev ed problems should be solved by math and English faculty, graduation problems should be solved by a transfer. Like we kind of siphon these things off into silos who are owning one thing, when in fact, there's a lot of collective wisdom in these rooms, in this room too. And we'll talk about some of these discussions in a minute. Continuous feedback. Here's one of my favorites. A sense of ownership over improving student outcomes, not blaming the student. We got a great history of this one, folks, in higher education in general, of saying things like, if we just had better students, everything would be fine. You hear that one a little bit? We just need better students. So a couple things here. One is that's very, very loose code for students don't look like what they used to look like. And we liked it when the students looked like what we used to look like. And so we got to call that out a little bit. But the second part of it is, just to share with you, at no point in American educational history have test scores, standardized test scores, been higher than they are right now. Now, I would not, by the way, argue that standardized test scores are that great of a predictor of a lot of things. At no point in history have they ever been higher than they are right now. This idea that our students are less qualified now is just not true when you look at the data, right? We'll talk about the DevEd thing in a minute, but we've raised cut scores for the past 15 years and made it harder for students to get into transfer level math and English courses. And if you look at your placement rates, you'll find they're pretty much the same as they were 15, 20 years ago. Which, by the way, means that the students are actually more qualified now because you raised the cut scores and the same number of them are still testing into those levels. We've actually made it harder. We've actually also, to use another law term, we've put the burden of proof on the student to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that they are college level material and they're ready to take transfer level courses. We don't do what we used to do, which is assume that if they've graduated high school with a 3.3 GPA, they probably can do this, right? Everyone distrusts their high schools. By the way, the other thing about this, we blame the student. Every segment of education blames the previous segment for the problems. Four-year schools blame us. If you just gave me better transfer students, which would all be fine. And by the way, our students do better than theirs on average who are at their junior year. Just as a small, it's not by a lot, but we do just fine there. We blame high schools. If high schools only gave us better students, high schools blame middle schools blame elementary schools, and everyone blames the parents. That's universal. Like if we just had better parenting, somehow the educational system would magically solve itself. What people don't often do is take a hard look at what we're doing and saying, is there a way we can do things differently than what we're doing? We know, by the way, if we do things the way we've always done them, we're going to get exactly the same results we get now. You know, so take the DevEd problem for a second. If you take students who are over 2 levels below in math right now and track using the traditional model of DevEd, how many of them ever pass a transfer level course? You guys know what that number is? It's less than 20%. You go 3 levels below, it's less than 10%. It's been that way for 40 years. It's that way across the country with some very small exceptions. And so we know what we get from that model, right? So the question is, why do we keep doing that model? Nothing's going to change if you keep doing things the same way we've always done them. I'd argue the same thing on graduation and completion rates in community colleges. You set up the same system, you're going to get the exact same outcomes. The students aren't going to magically turn into the top 2% of students, right? And so the other piece of this is believing that it's possible to improve things with the students you have. So Georgia State University is my favorite example of this. Downtown Atlanta, very urban university. Georgia State had a 31% grad. By the way, their population is not so much different than maybe the upper third of our community college population of entering students in terms of quote unquote academic ability. And so their graduation rate 10 years ago was 31%. It's 10 years later now, their graduation rate is 53%. And they said when they started this project, by the way, and 31% is not that bad for an urban regional 4-year institution, it's actually in the middle of the range, but they've gone to the top. And they've done this with doing a lot of things. A lot of it's the type of questions they asked about data, which I'll talk about. But the other thing they said when they started this is, we're not going to find better students. We could also have done that by raising the average entering SAT score from 950 to 1400. They said, we're going to do this with the students we already have. Their population in that 10-year period went from 40% underrepresented minorities, primarily African American, to 60% underrepresented. They almost 50% higher URM students. The graduation rate's gone up 21 points. Their unmet financial need has gone up. They've done a number of things. There's no silver bullet here, but they, more than anyone, have this culture of inquiry I'm talking about. They ask questions about where students are hitting barriers, and they immediately act to change them. And I'll kind of weave in some of their story throughout this. And then the idea is that we actually act on this. So here's, even though I'm not a framework guy, we did have to create a framework for this project. This is not much different from any of the, study, plan, do, act cycles, or whatever the accreditation folks talk about, where we have a plan, we put it into place, we see how things go, and we change. We talk about exploring how to improve outcomes, gathering meaning evidence, discussing it broadly, using it to inform change, and measuring the impact. I'm going to go into each of these a little more without getting too framework, but I would argue that what we've done in the last 10 years in the community colleges is exactly 2 words on this page. What words are they? We've gathered evidence. I skipped over meaningful for a reason. That's what we've done the last 10 years. We've gathered evidence. No one thinks we don't have enough data. Lots of people think they don't have the right data and that we haven't done anything with it. This is the classic thing from industry. We are data rich but information poor. You know, that's pithy and trite and everything, but it's actually pretty descriptive of what goes on. We have lots of data. We haven't spent a lot of time exploring it or using it, right? So the right data. And so I'm going to talk about that a little. So I'm going to talk for a second about how we spend our time. So this, usually I ask practitioners this question, but I'm going to change this question slightly and ask you. I've asked this question maybe 150 times in the last 5 years. So I'll change this to, when was the last time you sat in a board meeting on your campus that used evidence to explore a key student progress, completion, labor market learning, or equity outcome for more than 20 minutes? So think board meeting now. That's where you guys live. When was the last time this happened? How many of you have had this happen in the last 3 months? Last 6 months. Okay, 1 and 6 months. 12 months? It's not a course of doing business. By the way, this isn't a gotcha or you're doing anything wrong. I've asked this question of groups of up to 500 community college practitioners. I've never seen more than 5% of the hands rise up. Because it just hasn't been the course of doing business. We don't, on average, ask these type of questions. We don't ask them in board meetings. We don't ask them in standing committee meetings on campus. Even colleges that are ATD colleges struggle with this question. There may be an ATD committee who looks at this type of stuff, but it's not something, we haven't changed our processes that much. So here's the other question. What type of questions do we spend our time answering? Think about your board meetings. What is the data you look at in board meetings? What do you most commonly see? Budgets. Budgets, buildings, bonds, enrollment. Enrollment, you'll see that too, right? Right, enrollment management, budgeting. And again, all of those things are critically important. It probably at the end of the day, given if you're like most trustees, you have a fiduciary responsibility to help the college be solvent, right? You need to focus on those things, but it's 100% on these things, right? For most of us, it's 100% about that part. It's the same way, by the way, if you go into division meetings and department meetings on the campus. It is not the course of doing business to manage these projects. And again, like I said, the first thing Sandy did when he got to Valencia is he outlawed the enrollment report from being used on campus. He said, we'll worry about that. You guys focus on coming back to me with conversations about student success and progress. Sounds trivial, but we don't even ask the right questions. Like, we don't ask questions about, if we want to get better at student success, you guys, as with the rest of us, have to ask different questions. And so let's talk about some of those questions. I'll tell the Malcolm Gladwell story. I don't do it as well as he does. What he's talking about in this video is he goes through this discussion of a colleague of his who was instrumental in the kind of food science world in the 1980s. And so this is a guy who was a researcher. People would come to him and ask a question. So Pepsi came to him in the 70s and asked Dr. Moskowitz this question. He said, we have this new thing called aspartame, and we want to make Diet Pepsi, right? And so we can put between 8% and 12% aspartame into a Pepsi to turn it into Diet Pepsi, and what will change there is the kind of sweetness to carbonation ratio. So they tasked this guy with, tell me what the right percentage is. What do people want in terms of level of sweetness in a Diet Pepsi? Okay, so this researcher went out and did what we would all do. He created a bunch of samples at everywhere from 8% up to 12%, got thousands of people in, collected data on what they preferred. They'd rank it on a 0 to 100 scale. And the data came back in, and everyone was expecting to see a bell curve, right? There's some number at which there's a clear answer to this question. And so the data came back, and it was a mess, right? It was all over the board. The preferences, it looked like another Rorschach test. There was no even predictable line to where people preferred this percentage to be. And so Malcolm Gladwell says, most people would at this point do what everyone in the food science world does, is pick 10%, right? We see messy data all the time. We would just pick out, I guess 10% is the answer. And so this researcher, Dr. Moskowitz, he sat there and puzzled over this for a while, and finally what he thought was the answer came to him. We've been asking the wrong question. The question we are asking is, what is the perfect Pepsi? Right? What is the perfect percentage at which we should create Diet Pepsi? His claim is the actual question we should have been asking is, what are the perfect Pepsis? What are the different products we could create that serve this market differently? And so he went around talking about this for years before anyone actually listened to him. And one of the first people who listened to him was Yeah?
Tom guy's on his way. He should
Okay.
be here in a few minutes.
By the time he gets here, I'll probably be past it, but that's okay. These things happen. The net of this story is he ended up working for Prego in the 80s. So Prego and Ragu were the two competing spaghetti sauces back in the 80s. Ragu was the market leader. Prego actually, by all testing, was actually the better product, right? It stuck to the pasta better. All the ways by which you would rate quality of spaghetti sauce, Prego was much better. But it was getting killed by Ragu in the market. And so the Prego people, he finally convinced these people that you're asking the wrong question, what is the perfect Prego? The actual answer is, what are the perfect Pregos? What are the products we could offer? So he did a bunch of research on every way you could vary spaghetti sauce, 46 different spaghetti sauce products, and threw it into a bit and got people, again, thousands of people to come in and give him the answer. We're good, man, I'm past it. Thank you very much, though. And his answer at the end of this, there are three things people care about when they are rating spaghetti. Three things people want in spaghetti sauce. Some like the traditional watery type method, some like spicy, and some like chunky, which he jokes about the term chunky. There's actually like a technical term, which is like food mass or something. There are people, though, who like the old model, the spicy model, and there are people who like their spaghetti sauce extra chunky. And Prego, it's Campbell Soup actually who owned Prego, came back to him and said, you mean a third of the people out there want chunky spaghetti sauce? No one at that time had a chunky spaghetti sauce. So Prego went and they put 4 or 5 spaghetti sauces into the market, and they made about $600 million on these new brands in the next 10 years. Solely because this guy asked a different question, not what's the best single product we can make, but what are the products we can make to serve the different markets? And so again, this has gone, of course, as most things do in our society, to the complete other end of the spectrum, and now we have 45 different versions of soap, mustards, everything, there's 45 versions of. But think about that for a second. That all came from asking one different question, which is, what do different people prefer? Like, what is the perfect Pepsi? What are the perfect Pepsis? I mean, what's your favorite soft drink? I guess the answer to that is all over the board. Diet Pepsi now has Diet Cherry, you have Dr. Pepper. You have these various products that are tailored to meet different segments of the market. And so that question we ask, and the point that I make with all this is, this is an organizing question of all improvement science. What problem are we trying to solve in our world? And so let's use an example. Let's talk about, my friend, the placement tests. So you guys know that on your campus, everyone uses placement tests. They are designed to put people into dev ed courses, into different levels of dev ed. So let me ask you this. The use of placement tests, what was the problem we were trying to solve with placement tests? Where to place them? Where are we going to place the students, right? So where in the curriculum should we place them? Anyone else formulate it differently, maybe? Yeah.
How to help students succeed in their first college course.
How to help students succeed in their first college course. I like that. It's a step in a different direction, which is, but you hit on a key point. So here are the two that I came up with answers to. One of them is, can we find a short instrument that will help us assign incoming students to various levels of math or English? Right? That's essentially one way you could ask this question. Your way is slightly different. How do we ensure higher levels of course success in transfer level math? You went even further to say like the first course, right? To make sure they have a success early on, which I think is already a different question. Because it assumes, by the way, they're going to take it first, or that it's a good idea to take it first, all of which are debatable, right? So these are the kind of questions we've asked with this placement test process, right? Are these the best questions to ask? Have we asked the right questions here? Are there different questions we might ask besides, is there a short instrument I can use to help assign incoming students to English and math? Any thoughts on what those questions might be?
Is the student college or career ready?
Yeah, how about that one? So let me tell you what mine are in this. And by the way, what if we tried to solve different problems? How about this one? What placement process is the most predictive? I'm going to go well past this one. We haven't asked this question. What placement process is the most predictive of transfer level course success until recently, when our friends up the road at CCRC at Teachers College did ask this question. They asked a version of this question which said, which is more predictive of transfer level course success, a placement test or a high school transcript? What do you think the answer to that question is? High school transcript. It is absolutely more predictive than the placement test, which shouldn't surprise us all that much, right? It's over 4 years. Or even if you took the last 2 years, it's over 2 years. It tells you what math courses they took and how they did. And then this is a 45-minute or 90-minute test that's supposed to magically figure out all that they've learned in 12 years, right? So, and by the way, interestingly, the transcript study, no one believes this is true at their college or their high school, right? Because we don't trust our high schools for the most part. There are some exceptions to this where there are great relationships between colleges and high schools. Most of us don't believe that it's true that the high school transcript would be better, more predictive, or at least equally predictive than the placement test process. Here's a story from California. Long Beach City College. Long Beach is kind of one of the largest port cities in the country, just south of LA. Long Beach City College was about to change their cut score in English for the 7th time in 10 years. So I don't know how much you guys get into cut scores, but generally what we're doing with cut scores is determining the point at which we say someone's transfer ready or what other courses we could throw people into. And I, as a former researcher, will tell you, I was never once asked to lower the cut score. I was asked quite often what happens if we raise the cut score, which makes it harder for students to get into the transfer level course and graduate eventually. You'll like where this is going in a second. So for the 7th time in 10 years, they're going to change this again, raising it for the 7th time in 10 years so that of the graduating high school seniors from Long Beach Unified High School District who came to the college, only 10% would be in the transfer level course. 90% would be placed pre-collegiately. And they were perfectly happy with this. So there's also a question about who's running the place and inmates running the asylum and this whole thing as well. But in California, I got to tell you, it's those folks own all the power. There's some positive things about that, but it's some crazy things that come out of that too. So the researcher at Long Beach City College, a friend of mine, John Hetz, happened to have access to high school transcript data in his area, which not all of us have, by the way. This is not something that you readily have available. But he actually threw the high school transcript data into a huge kind of statistical analysis called cluster analysis. And he tried to find variables that were predictive of success in the transfer level course. So he found an algorithm that worked really well. It predicted the same level of success in the transfer level course, which happened to be 57%. So before, the success rate in English was 57%. The changing of the cut score was trying to make it 57%. His algorithm also predicted 57%. But here's the kicker. Using high school transcript data, he was able to put that group that was going to be 10% was 55%. 5 times as many students, he said, with his algorithm, would be predicted to be able to have the same level of success in the transfer level course, which is already a fascinating story. But most of you are asking, well, is that true, or is it just some statistical anomaly? So the crazy part of this story from me being from California is they actually convinced their faculty to do this. And the English department at Long Beach said, sure, we'll try this. So they, in fall of 2012, put 5 times as many students in the transfer level math course using this new algorithm based on high school transcript. What do you think happened to the success rate in that course? Didn't change 1%. It was 56.4 or something. So they got 5 times as many students through that model in one semester as would have happened in, by the way, 5 times as many, 55% of students don't get through the sequence under the old model. They got 5 times as many through in one semester. Follow them forward, their average number of units are better. So again, we may be asking the wrong question. The placement test may work to categorize folks into groups. That's, by the way, what it's designed to do, is separate people into groups. It's not actually designed to predict transfer level success. It's designed to separate people into groups. And if you look at the chart of success versus cut score, at the way bottom, if students have a really low score, they have a really low chance of success in the transfer course. And at the very top, they have a very high chance of success. We like to believe there's some magic stepwise function where you can pick a score where the success rate jumps 30 points. What it actually looks like is a Rorschach, a scatter plot that goes like this. So you can stick that cut score anywhere along about a 30-point continuum, and you're going to move the success rate by 1 point. Yet we've constantly made it harder. So I'd argue maybe we're asking the wrong question. And I still think there's 3 other questions we can ask here, but which placement process is more predictive? In this case, the transcript versus placement test, they're equally predictive. But the kicker is the transcript model gets a lot more students as college ready, right? North Carolina, based on CCRC's version of this research, all of their 57 colleges, they phased it in over 3 years, fall 13 through fall 15. They have a new rule in North Carolina. If you have a 2.6 high school GPA, you are in transfer level math and English, end of story. Now, there are some folks who worry about this. What's going to happen to the courses? Are we going to have lots of students failing? The research from CCRC is pretty clear. We underplace somewhere between 33 and 38% of students. We overplace like 7% of students. So will they overplace some students with their new model? Of course they will, right? And they're going to need some support to do that. So we talked to some of these faculty already who did this early version in fall 13, and we asked the folks in English and math, has your classroom changed any? Now that you have all these new students, like on average there, it's about 30% more students in there. Has your classroom changed any? And the English folks said, nope, hasn't changed one iota. The math faculty, there was a kind of a dichotomy. Half of them reported it's exactly the same as it was, and half of them said, you know what, there's probably a couple more students who are clearly struggling, but overall it's pretty close. So, you know, looking into the classrooms, they're not seeing a big difference. And again, many more students are going to get through. So that question might be the issue here. Or what about this question? Hey, how about this one? What's the optimal curricular structure to ensure that the greatest number of students pass transfer level math and English courses? I know that's really pithy and well written. The point here is, do we have the right curricular structure? By the way, the curricular structure in math was invented for exactly one purpose. What is that purpose? Success in calculus. The math sequence that we currently use in education, higher and lower education, is a progression of courses that has one purpose, and that is that people can succeed through calculus. How many of you use calculus in your day-to-day lives? Does anyone? I don't, by the way, and I'm a statistician on some days. I don't use calculus. You know who uses calculus? Scientists and doctors. What percentage of your students are in science, and sometimes business calculus comes in like actuarial stuff. Most of our students don't actually need the course sequence. And I'm not saying this, by the way. This is researchers in math, researchers in the workforce, the folks at Georgetown who study the workforce. Tony Carnevale and his friends have said, you know what most students need in the real world? They need a quantitative reasoning course or a statistics course so they can actually think about math in the real world. And it's not saying, and by the way, those courses can be at the same level of rigor. So there are all these programs. And I heard from one of your folks that someone's been doing a Statway Quantlay-like program for like 15 years that's been working really well. Why not, rather than have 4 courses leading up to the college algebra course, have one course that leads to a statistics course for your non-STEM majors? Interesting idea, right? If you do that, by the way, you find that it is 2.5 times more effective. The old model gets 20% of the students through, the new model, 55, 57%. And by the way, it's not just one program. There are numerous national initiatives that have done this. If you change the sequence and make, by the way, why do most people hate math? Because it's hard. So that's actually an interesting point about productive persistence, which I'll talk about. What's the other reason most people hate math? They fear it. They fear it. Do they see it as useful in the real world? When was the last time you factored a polynomial? Yeah, calculating a mortgage, that's where math's important, right?
Do it on the internet.
Yeah, right. And so we've made an assumption somewhere along the way that the way we teach math is the best way to do what I ask in the next question, which is, what's the optimal math curriculum that produces the learning outcomes that most students will need in the real world? Which, by the way, is still a different question than the last one. I think this question's pretty important because the current model, people are afraid of math. Math is too theoretical and not as applied. And by the way, I've been told by my mathematician friends, what I am talking about is called Math Wars 3. I wasn't around for the first 2. I don't know what they were. But Math Wars 3 is this idea that there are alternate pathways through math that might work for most students. And they're about half the math faculty, by the way, and they're usually the younger ones and a smattering of the more senior ones who say, you know what, you're right. Most people don't need the math that we've been teaching them. They need a different, not a course of lower rigor, but different. Focused on statistics, focused on being able to quantitatively reason in the real world. And so maybe this is a different answer than the current curricular sequence we have. So you go all the way back to the placement test question. Can we find a short instrument that will help assign incoming students to various levels of math or English? Malcolm Gladwell will say that's the Pepsi question, right? We're asking the wrong question here. By the way, when we ask this question, it assumes a number of things. It assumes we need an instrument to predict this. And it also assumes that the number of levels in the current curricular structure is the right structure. And when we focus our energies here, we might actually be missing the real question, which is there a better way to do this? And one of my favorite ones, which my English faculty friends love, this is also, I don't know if I'm creating English Wars 3 here too, but is writing about literature the optimal way to teach students the writing skills they need in their gen ed courses of the real world? I, by the way, don't know the answer to this question. And I say that immediately to my English friends who get very mad at me when I ask this question. But is it the best way to teach writing in the real world? You guys are in the real world. How do you think about your students' writing skills? Yeah, we do these surveys of industry and we find, yeah, exactly. Well, there's the texting. So the writing skills for what we need in the real world are very different than what we teach. By the way, it's also true in gen ed courses. I mean, we assume that the English sequence is producing people who can write a history essay or a psychology essay. It's not the same thing. There's this video clip I lost somewhere along the way. There's a video clip from this professor who is retiring from Indiana University, who is, because he's retiring, felt he could say whatever the hell he wanted. It was awesome. And he went off on the way we teach writing. He said, look, we can I can take the same paper, and he used, I think, an example of ethics in science, right? As a 10-page paper on the ethics of artificial intelligence. And I'll have a scientist grade it, I'll have a sociologist grade it, I'll have an English faculty grade it, and I'll have whatever the other discipline grade it. And I'm going to get 4 different grades because they're looking for 4 different things. And we assume that writing is writing, right? And so I actually think this is a really interesting question. And I think most of the folks in industry would say, I don't know what you're doing, but it's not producing writing skills that I can use in the real world. My other favorite example of this, of course, is our friend critical thinking. By the way, institutional learning outcomes is like a Mad Libs with the same 12 words put in different orders. You know, there's computation, some form of that. It can be called analytical, any type of thing. There's communication side. There's critical thinking / problem solving. There's usually some sort of citizenship, global citizenry, sometimes information technology. But they're all the same 5 things. What I find interesting about this is critical thinking, right? So if you ask people in industry what is the biggest problem, by the way, not with community college graduates, but 4-year graduates. My wife works at Amgen, which is the largest biotech firm in the world in South San Francisco, and she's a researcher. And I met the person who hires their new scientists there. They basically hire from 4 institutions, which I pointed out to him is probably pretty limiting. Stanford, Caltech, MIT, and Berkeley is essentially who they hire their folks from. And I asked him about, well, what's your retention rate for these new hires? He said 50% of them will be gone in a year. And it's not because they don't know their stuff, it's because they can't live in the real world. They can't communicate, they can't critically think, they don't work well in teams. It's all the stuff we hear back from industry that our graduates, not our community college graduates, this is not about fixing the community college system. It's what are these skills we're trying to imbue in these students? And by the way, where do students learn critical thinking in higher education right now? If you were to point to where in your curriculum students learn critical thinking, what would it be? That's what I say too, right? I don't know, and by the way, individual faculty will say, well, I have this way of this one test where I do make sure that they can do critical thinking or problem solving in the real world. And it's not, again, part of what we're trying to do here, right? And by the way, Common Core, theoretically, is supposed to help us with this a little by taking away standardized memorization type tests and making them more applied. I'm cautiously optimistic it'll at least be a step in the right direction. But the idea of kind of deeper and more applied learning, again, we may be asking the wrong questions here. So I think this is a really important frame. And so to sum up this first stage, more focus on asking the right question, less on the answers, right? We're too worried about the data. What do the data tell us? Well, and this is, I think, the point that Gladwell makes. Sometime exploring the data can actually help you realize you've been asking the wrong question. That's one thing looking at the data first can do for you, is say, you know what, are we even asking the right question here? So I think in your role as trustees, unsolicited opinion, I guess it's sort of semi-solicited opinion, you need to work on asking these questions differently. Right, Larry?
Can I ask a quick question?
You can ask more than a quick question.
So part of our model right now for doing community college business in New Jersey, like other states, placement tests.
Yep.
Our placement test, and a large part of your message is it's a hurdle. We give it to students cold. A lot of our trustees and presidents, Bakari has an interest in brush-up courses, so we're doing more of that, trying to address that. But nevertheless, despite our best efforts, in many cases, because of the placement test, we're burying students, so to speak, in developmental ed from which they never escape. So, Florida legislature recently blew it all up. Florida legislature says to its community colleges, you may no longer require remediation. You may no longer require placement tests. Connecticut legislature took a similar step, not quite as severe, so to speak. What's your take on that?
So it's a really interesting, to me, research problem, right? And so I think I would agree that on some level, there's a certain floor below which this is not a good idea, right? So there's some point at which, if students are in 4th grade arithmetic levels, they're not going to succeed in a transfer level statistics course. So there's probably a floor to this, but I would argue that floor is a lot lower than we thought it was. And so the way, I really like what North Carolina's done. I think that's the way to go with this, which is 2.6 GPA, fine, you're in transfer level math and English. If you're below that,
No placement test?
no placement test. 2.6 high school GPA, end of story. It's a version of the Long Beach story. Slightly different. They're doing it at all 57 colleges.
I think the Salem Community College, Dr. Bailey, or President Bailey, you recently did that?
Yeah, tell me about what happened.
The data from this past year says they do at least as well, if not better.
Right, and you put more of them in there, right? I mean, so.
We did, but we took 3.0.
In fact, CCRC did a study on the 3.0, and the North Carolina presidents, they had this whole debate about whether it should be 3.0. A bunch of them said 3.0 is not low enough. We want more students to have this opportunity. Larry, I would take your point one step further. Exactly 0% of our students come here to major in Dev Ed. They're not here to take Dev Ed, right? They're here to do something else. By the way, are math and English important? Of course they're important. But I'd also point out, I don't know where along the line being college ready was defined by only math and English. That happened somewhere too, and this data I'm about to show you is going to suggest we may be looking at that problem wrong too. Math and English, by the way, are highly predictive of success in GE courses. I'll show you some data in a minute that may suggest it's not the math and English that's actually the issue. It might be something else. So I think, Larry, most people would say that Connecticut and Florida went a little too far because you're going to have the people who are at the bottom of the kind of bell curve really struggling. So the question I have about that is they weren't, by the way, ever getting out of Dev Ed anyway. So I actually don't attack this from the problem of this is worse for them because none of them ever got out anyway who are that low. What I worry about is the resources of the faculty in the transfer level course being diverted from those who are in the middle that you put up to only dealing with the folks who are at the bottom. So I worry a little bit about that. If you gave me one of the two choices, I'd certainly take what Florida or Connecticut does over what we do now. But I think there's a middle ground somewhere. And I like the way North Carolina did it. It said, by the way, those people who are below 2.6 can still take a placement test and test into transfer level. Right? So it's not dooming them if they're below a 2.6. So they basically have multiple ways to get in there. But I think it's I actually think we have bigger problems to wrestle with than this particular one, but we need to get this one out of the way so we can get to some of the bigger problems. So I think it's a really good observation. Okay, so here are our traditional questions. We talked about what they are. They're about enrollment, course success, material covered. The emerging questions are about outcomes. How are we doing at producing completion outcomes, progress learning outcomes? Are our students learning? How do we know that they're learning? The assessment, I love the idea of assessing that learning better and having it be authentic. The problem is we haven't done much of that. Here's a big one. How about labor market? You guys, especially as trustees, we have this kind of quietly under the table contract in higher ed that if you come and do this, you invest either your parents' money, and increasingly with our students, take loans to come do this, there'll be a payoff in the labor market. Which is true in some areas and completely, this is by the way a 4-year problem too. We have lots of programs in the community college that have higher annual starting wages than many 4-year bachelor's degree programs. They don't like hearing this, by the way, but it's absolutely true. I majored in psych, okay? And if you were to ask me to counsel, I don't know, there's probably some other psych majors in here. I would tell someone who's by the way, psych is either always the first or second largest major at 4-year institutions behind business. I would tell people going into psych, it's fine if you want to go into psych if you're willing to get 2 or 3 degrees. Your first degree gets you almost nothing. You will work, as many of my friends did, at Enterprise Rent-A-Car for your first couple of years after college. By the way, not a bad place to start. There are worse places to start. But most people aren't going to college to get a degree to then work at Enterprise, right? So nothing wrong with psychology as a major, but if you're going to do that, you should know it's a 6-year, or as mine was, a 9-year investment. You don't necessarily have to pay for all that at times. You can get loans. But we're not very good at this idea. What are the labor market outcomes for our students? I think we should tell students what they are. Say, you want to do cosmetology? Fine. Know that you're going to make $18,000 when you come out. That may sound like a lot of money now to students, which goes back to the whole mathematical thing again. But, or you can maybe major in something different that's got an average wages of $40,000. So we actually are starting to get more and more of that data, but I think it's a whole different set of questions. And then obviously the equity questions. I have it's coming up. So let me do this real quick. This is the point about making sure you're focusing on the right data. I'm going to show you a chart that gives the 20-year course success rate history for the entire California community college system. I want you to give me your first reaction to this line, right here. What's happened over 20 years in the California community college system? Nothing has happened, right? So now we'll play the spin game. Spin this positively. Haven't gotten worse. Maybe it was already as high as it could get. We haven't lost. It's stable.
We're educating many more people.
There's a good one. I like that one. We're educating so many more people than we were before that keeping the same level of success is pretty good. The flip side of that one, which is usually the negative one, is students these days aren't what they used to be, and we kept the same level of success, right? We hear that one all the time. I don't let that one go, by the way. Like, really, students are what they used to be? What data do you have to suggest that students are? Because, by the way, if you have placement data from 30 years ago, you'll find it looks pretty similar to what it does right now. But yeah, so it hasn't gotten worse. What's the other thing that's changed? You guys know this side. What about the finances in higher ed? Funding's gone down in 20. It hasn't gone up in 20 years. By the way, it's the only segment of education where it's gone down. It's actually gone up in K-12 and gone up in four-year schools. It's gone down in most community college systems in this country. And so we could say, yeah, we've gotten lower finances and we're still putting the same outcomes. So now spin it negatively for a second. What's a negative spin on this finding? Haven't gotten better. And what have we been doing for the last 20 years? We didn't pay much attention, I would argue, the last 8 years. We've been trying to improve this and it hasn't gone anywhere. Right? Now, of course, I would argue at that point, we've tried to improve this by doing small things on the margin. I mean, if you're going to improve a number like this, you've got to change things that are bigger than the things we've changed so far. But I would also argue, how useful is this as a metric? Remember, this is course success, right? What's the single, if we do look at success rates in community colleges, what's the one thing we look at most? Course success rates. Till recently, now we're starting to change this. Things like ATD changes, things like your statewide, what do you guys call it?
Big ideas.
The big ideas. How can you forget big ideas? Wasn't a big enough idea for me. Here's one way of thinking about it. I work on this Aspen Prize, and one of the things I like about this is they've said, here are the 4 outcomes that matter. We've got progress and completion outcomes, we've got labor market outcomes, we've got learning outcomes, we've got equity in achieving those first 3. That's what matters at the end of the day. Learning is critical here because this is the one that plays out in the labor market. Do students think critically? Do they have the content expertise they need? Yeah, that's one thing. But are they able to work in the workplace? And then these equity questions. I have a whole appendix presentation here, which will probably bore most of you, but if you want it, have examples of good data in each of these areas, right? Really good progress and completion data, really good labor market data, and I won't have time to get to it today, but I want to show you one study that I think is really useful, just as a starting point. And I'll finish with another example of what I think you want something to take back to your colleges. I'll give you one thing to take back for sure. So this is a classic question. We're going to look at the relationship between English and math success, level of English and math, and how students do in gen ed courses. So anyone used to teach psych in here besides me? Anyone used to teach psych? No, okay, I'll represent our psych faculty here. So this is a classic story of the whole issue of prerequisites, right? So the issue of prerequisites is there a certain level of math and English we should require for someone to be able to take gen ed courses? Most states are like you guys. We don't really do this very often. There are some states that have really strong prerequisites. New Jersey, I think, is from what I asked earlier, like California. You don't have a lot of strong prerequisites. And so we were looking at this in California because our state senate wanted to change. There were 2 requirements to be able to put on a prerequisite. One is it needed to make sense from a content standpoint. If you're going to write a 14-page history paper, you need to be able to read and write at a college-level English course, which, by the way, is an interesting, did we ask the right question argument? Because is writing a 14-page paper something they're learning in a college-level English course for that course? But let's just assume that question's okay. But the other requirement in California is, do you have data to support that if students don't have the prerequisite you're going to put on, they're not going to succeed in the course, right? So there's a data requirement to this. That's actually not a trivial question, by the way. And so I was asked, as a friend of the state senate, which is odd because in the end they hated me for this study, to say, what do you think about this? What about this idea about data? It's like, well, tell you what I'll do. I'll look at students who are at various levels of English. This is a sequence at an old college. You have some students who are 2 below, 1 below, transfer A and transfer B. And because we don't have prerequisites, I will find them when they're in their psych course, and a lot of them will be taking it in the same semester. If I look over a long enough period of time, in any given psych course, there are a bunch of students who are also in English. I know what level they're at, right? I know which of these levels. I don't use the placement test database because, for better or for worse, it's unclean on top of being useless for other reasons. It's not actually clean data. Whenever I got asked a question about cut scores, I mentally multiplied times 5 the amount of time it should take to do this study because the database is not clean. So I did this simultaneously enrolled study. So here's what I did. I looked at students who are, by the way, and if you go over a long enough period of time, about 1/3 of students in any given psych course, this is intro psych, are taking an English course, and here's their levels. So there's not a lot of people who are in this course who are 2 levels below. There's enough, by the way, to have a valid sample. So let's look at success rates for those students in my psych class, intro psych. So if they were at transfer B, the highest levels, these 2 transfer level courses, they had pretty high success rates in my psych course. If you went down to 1 level below, it dropped to 48%, and to 2 levels below to 31%. So what does any reasonable human being conclude when looking at this slide? What do we need? We need a prerequisite, right? We need a prerequisite of eligibility for this course. They don't have to have passed it, apparently. But if they need to be eligible for this course to succeed in Psych 1, couple things there. What's the problem we're trying to solve here with prerequisites?
So they can do the things you're asking them to do in Psych 1.
Yeah, and we're asking the question, do we need a prerequisite to ensure a certain level of course success? Again, right? Because we're only focused on Psych 1. So by the way, if we were really serious about improving course success, we'd just keep raising the cut score. So high that only students who could get a 95% success rate in the course would get into the course. The problem is there'd be 2 of those students. So again, the question we're asking here, yeah, this is predictive, right? So these students, on average, have a lower level of course success than these. But here's the epiphany I was mentioning earlier. So the financial aid tech in the back asked the question at this point, and I had the next slide ready, and I'm not above planting a slide, so I would have done it. She asked the question, hey, that's really interesting. What about math in Psych 101? How well does math predict success in Psych 1? So I will let you know there's absolutely 0 math in Psych 1. There's no research methods, there's no statistics. It's 15 chapters of psychology, 15 weeks, 1 chapter a week. I'm sure your faculty don't teach us this way, but there's a quiz at the end of each week and 4 tests that are multiple choice. That's Psych 1. Okay? I'm sure none of your faculty taught it that way. However, that's what Psych 1 is. So there's no math in Psych 1. Okay, so what happens when we look at math? So now you have 3 courses that are pre-transfer. Here's what happens. Looks exactly the same. Math is equally predictive of success in Psych 1. So if I'd shown you this side first and asked you the question, what should we do about this? You reasonably could say, we need a prerequisite of transfer level math for Psych 1. Okay, and by the way, if that's the problem you're trying to solve, it'll work. But what's the problem here? Let me ask this question first. Why are math and English equally predictive of Psych? What are some reasons that might be true? There's about 10 I hear all the time. So what are some reasons that math and English are equally predictive? They're learners, right? So there's a couple ways you can go with this one. I hear versions of this one. One is what I call the Spearman's G argument, which is a psych term for generalized intelligence. Smarter students are smarter, they're going to do better. Not smart students are not smart, they're not going to do as well. But then you could also go with kind of the more active process of learning, which I think is where you were going, which is the students who are successful know how to succeed. They have college success type skills, other things. What are some other, by the way, I don't have an answer to this question, but what I think is interesting is we don't actually ask these questions. We don't sit and talk about what might be going on. So what are some other reasons this might happen? Why might math be equally predictive? Maybe math and English are correlated. Right? Maybe they're in the same courses at the same time. That, by the way, isn't it, because I've checked it independently. Maybe it's reading. Maybe you need to read in all of these courses, including math, right? I think there's also the whole college success argument. Students who have been successful in courses in college have a certain level of study skills. You could go down the study skills argument. You could also throw out, by the way, a really interesting set of variables that are the non-cognitive ones. Things like motivation, confidence, hope, grit, social capital, by the way, all of which have been researched to be highly predictive of success in college. And I'd argue for it by looking at this data, math and English are clearly proxies for something. The question is, if they're proxies for something, what are we doing to develop students on those things they're proxies for? Where are we working on motivation, on confidence, on hope, on grit? What I love about the Statway Quantway stuff from Carnegie is half of that is about a changed curricular structure. The other is they actively work on the concept of productive persistence. The idea that you need to struggle through things to actually learn them. And you shouldn't stop when you struggle. You should be happy when you struggle because you're actually learning it more deeply. That is not a behavior that's ingrained in any of us as humans, much less community college students who haven't had this kind of thing in front of them before. So I think this is really interesting data because I think, again, we may have asked the wrong question. And again, math and English, by the way, are highly predictive of this success rate. But one thing we need to worry about is how many people actually survive math and English as they're currently taught. right? Not many people get out of those dev ed. So by the way, one of the other answers here to why this might happen is this is a survival analysis. Most of our students go to dev ed. The ones who actually survive our dev ed sequences, and there aren't that many who get up to here, they're pretty successful students, right? I'm not sure we want to try to force students to run through a gauntlet to be successful. But just to make the last point on this before I kind of close up here with one last other example. I did this for a series of 10 courses, which were all GE courses at my college, to prove it wasn't an artifact of psychology. And by the way, the green bars are a little weird because they tend to have small sample sizes. But you see the same overall trend. Then I did it for these 5 courses. I always stop on this slide. This is my Easter egg slide. There's something hidden on this slide which I think is really cool. It's not this. What do you when you look at this slide, what kind of jumps out at you? Overall trends are the same. Got that? Yeah. How about the courses? What are the courses here? Sociology, biology, this is actually music theory, accounting. What's this course over here? Let's talk about this one for a second. So we're going to play Northern California Stereotypes, one of my favorite games. This is a fitness course at a Northern California community college. What are the 2 stereotypical fitness activities in Northern California? Surfing and skiing. Rollerblade, that's Southern California. We don't talk about those folks down there. I mean, yoga. Skiing's way north. You got to go up in the mountains. Great skiing, by the way. Surfing and yoga are the 2 common answers, by the way, both of which my college offered. This is yoga. This course right here is yoga. It's not a history of yoga, critical analysis, selected readings and writings in yoga from 1466 to 1920. This is roll out the mat, sweat, and stretch yoga. And by the way, what do you see here? English is equally predictive of success in the yoga course. Now what? By the way, you could put a prerequisite on yoga if you cared about the success rate of yoga, of college level English. You get higher success rates. To me, this screams of there's something else going on here. It's not, by the way, our math and English, I don't ever want to say math and English aren't important. They're probably less important than we think they are as they're currently taught. But what this says to me is we're missing the boat here. Whatever the answer is, and I could argue college study skills, just being a college student. By the way, how about student financial stability? I work on this other project with Lumina that's going to produce this thing you guys can all use this summer. Is going to be a self-assessment tool to show how do you deal with your lowest income students, and what are the things you might do to actually improve their outcomes. I've got some slides on this that I'll show you in the after dinner presentation that I think are pretty powerful. But again, English is equally predictive of fitness. So now at this point, the reading gets thrown out the door, study skills kind of get thrown out the door. You know, there's other things that, by the way, and again, all those things are still important. But if we didn't ask that second question, we never would have gotten to any of this. So here's my net of where does this get us? The idea here is that this idea of creating a culture of inquiry on your campus, it's not magic. It's not some ephemeral thing we can't. You guys actually own pieces of this. Everyone on the campus owns a piece of this. Presidents and trustees have a particular piece of, you need to ask different questions. You need to ask people to ask different questions, and you start getting down the path of getting clearer answers, and they need to be questions about student outcomes. We do focus on the data too much, and the last thing I would say is, let's constantly ask ourselves, what problem are we trying to solve? Placement test one's really instructive to me, because it says, yeah, if what we're trying to do is stick people into various levels and figure out which level they best fit into, current placement test process works fine. But those other 4 questions we ask, is this the right way is it the best way of placing students? Are we even asking the wrong question about placing them? What are the skills they need in the real world? Not to say that college isn't the real world, but you know what I mean. Like, those are different types of questions. And I think the things you can do as trustees, help your folks make those questions important. Presidents do the same thing, by the way, model this behavior. I want to know what student success looks like for your group of students. Let's talk about some questions you could ask. And so what I love, I did this thing at a symposium a couple weeks ago. It had 25 presidents coming together for a 2-day symposium. And they each had to write a statement of what they were going to try to do to develop a culture of inquiry on their campus. And the end state for this one college, which I thought was great. I want a wider range of people on my campus to ask a better set of questions about outcomes and act on their reflections to improve them. That's not some mythical thing. It's pretty straightforward. What do I need? I need more people asking questions. I want those to be better questions about outcomes, and I want them to act on the reflections. I want us to improve this. Like, it's a frame. We're not there. Some of your campuses are probably more there than others, but this is what we're shooting for. And so I said I'd give you, and by the way, I got a lot of stuff on the website that I run that you can look at here, but I want to give you one last example that I used from earlier on kind of the completion side. And that is, how many of your colleges have nursing programs? Right, most of you guys do. So I very rarely am prescriptive in saying you guys should do something. I'm going to tell you a scenario here that leads me to believe that anyone who has a nursing program should take a look at this. How many students do your nursing student program accept a year? Anyone more than 100? More like 50 to 80? What's yours? Like 100 a year? Let's call it 100. So you guys accept 100 nursing students a year. How many pre-nursing students do you have? 1,500, 2,000 maybe, right? So first of all, why is that? Why do we have so many pre-nursing students? I mean, this isn't rock. They want good jobs, they want good wages, they want stability. So part of the thing I would argue here, by the way, is we haven't done a great job at pointing out to students there are some other fields we have programs in that also have great jobs, that are career, family-sustaining wages, that you don't have to get into a nursing program for. So one of the things I'll share with you is that most of the nursing programs have some sort of entrance requirement, right? Maybe a 3.0 GPA, a couple other things. So here's what a college in Ohio did, Stark State. They wrestled with this problem, and they said, we have like 2,500 students who think themselves as pre-nursing. It's probably more than that, by the way, because it's not something people talk about. But behaviorally, they looked at it and said, all right, if we have a 3.0 entrance requirement to our nursing program, how many students do I currently have that have less than a 3.0 GPA who think they are pre-nursing? And so they ran a list of all the students who had a 2.0 to 2.9 GPA, and they put them into buckets, into a matrix. And then they said, we'll look at the ones who are close, 2.7 to 2.9, the ones in the middle, 2.3 to 2.7, the ones at the bottom, 2.0 to 2.3. They also looked at the number of units they'd taken, right? 0 to 15, 15 to 30, 30 to 45. And they went into this and they customized their interventions to this matrix. So the ones who are at the top, 2.7 to 2.9 GPA, regardless of the units, they said, you know what, you're almost there. 3.0 GPA requirement is what we need. You're almost there, and here's a GPA calculator so you can figure out how many courses you need to take at what grade to make your GPA 3.0. Another thing to do when you're bored is to try to solve that problem on your own. That is not a trivial math problem. You are at 2.72 GPA with 43 units. How many courses do you need to take, we'll even make it easy, where you get all A's, where your GPA is a 3.0? And that's the easy one. And by the way, if they were all A's, they wouldn't be a 2.73 GPA, right? So this is actually an incredibly complicated problem. I actually set up an Excel model to do it. It took me about an hour to set up an Excel model that worked. That said, okay, if you get 4 B's and 2 C's and 3 A's, where are you then? To say, how would I get to 3.0? So they gave their students a tool they could use to figure it out, which I think is already great. And by the way, that tool is widely available and publicly available. The middle group, the 2 3s to 2 7s, the ones who had fewer units, they kind of gave them the same message as the top ones because they could get there still, right? When you started getting to having more units and being like a 2.4 GPA, they started to those groups saying, you know, here's the GPA calculator, here's your path to getting there, but it's pretty long, maybe we should talk about some of these other programs we had. Bottom level, 2.0s to 2.3s. For these students, they said, you must come in and talk to us and see an advisor before you register for your next class. They brought them in and they told these students, this is going to sound horrible, you are never going to be in our nursing program. You need to stop taking courses that are leading you to nursing and change to something else.
Before you use up all your financial.
Yes, so this is where I'm getting. Stop stealing my thunder. I mean, that's too far. No, so here, I'm kidding. So here's the deal. So they had students crying in their offices, right? And so we look at this and say, wow, how can we do this to students? This is the exact issue that she brings up. If we didn't do this, and by the way, none of the rest of us do this, I would argue, we are letting these people merrily go down the path, thinking they at some point have a chance of getting into the nursing program. They have absolutely no chance. They would, by the way, be better off leaving your school and starting over at a new school. It would be easier to get into a nursing program that way than it would to be in your pre-nursing program. And so, which also is this, I think it's a moral and ethical issue, by the way. We are merrily collecting tuition dollars from these folks, and they are merrily taking financial aid loans with something that's not going to happen. Right, and so they, by the way, there weren't 40 of these students, there were 700 of these students who were in the lowest 2 levels. So here's something to take back with you. Think about your competitive programs, not just nursing, if you have other competitive programs. Think about the students who are trying to get into that program and where they are in their progression through your college. And when I do my completion-focused presentations, I talk a lot about using the information you already have to help manage your students' progression. We know who these students are. You know, right now, your campus, I'm sure there are hundreds of them who have a 2.4 GPA and are never going to get into your nursing program, right? I think it becomes dependent on us to actually do something about this. I love what Stark State did. I can share with you the case study if you fire me an email on it. I think there are some other examples of this. I will close with this idea of if there's one other thing you can do to improve student outcomes, it's actually informing students of where they are on their own pathway, right? Very cool project coming out of Ohio where when students go to register for courses at Sinclair in Ohio, and they go to register for a course that's not on their pathway, screen pops up, says, hey, by the way, do you know you're about to register for a course that's not on your pathway? Do you really want to do that? If you think students have any idea when they're registering for courses what that course means for their pathway, I'm telling you they don't. And it's not necessarily their fault, by the way. We've made it so complicated that it's hard to navigate. At Santa Fe in Florida, they have a version of the same thing. They actually, if you go to register for a course that's off their pathway, it does the same thing. The other thing Santa Fe's does is if you say, I want to come to class Monday, Wednesday, Friday from 8 to noon, it checks all the available open courses that you need on your pathway and gives you a sample schedule. Talk about and they've been doing this for 10 years, by the way. Because our pathways are so unclear, and I would argue we should make them more clear, we need to do more of this stuff to help students get through. One of the other things we talked about with the last group in the second presentation, and I'm doing a different second one today, so I'll share with it here. When do you communicate about progress toward the degree to your students? What are the only 2 times you do that right now? Apply for graduation is one. And beginning, I don't think we actually give them, they're not progress information, but I agree with you. We talk to them then. What's the other time? And it's not for everybody. It's probation. So by the way, we communicate to them about their progress when they're either done or they're on their way out. We do nothing the rest of the time. You have all your students are just about to finish spring semester. Why not recognize those who just got 3/4 of the way to their degree? Say, nice job, you're in your last semester. What do you have left? Here's what you have left. Or those who got halfway there. So celebrating the progress. The flip side of this is when students have a bad semester, why not intervene? You know what their overall history was. Florida State does this. They call it, and I wouldn't call it this, the good and bad list. Now, they don't tell it to students, that's what the list is called. But if the student has an overall GPA that in any given semester jumps by 0.3 or drops by 0.3, you're on either the good list or the bad list. The bad list folks, they contact and say, hey, we saw you'd been doing pretty well overall. You just had a tough semester. How can we help? To the ones who did well, they said, hey, you've done a great job this semester, much better than you were doing before. Congratulations, nice work. How can we help? The idea of changing the nature of this conversation with the students, I think is really important. We have so much data on, by the way, what their barriers are. And this is not an IR problem, it's that we haven't asked the questions. Where do students struggle? In the business program, what's the key course in the business program that students struggle most with? Accounting. By the way, it might be different at different colleges. Why don't we know this? We have the data. We need to ask different questions about it and communicate that information back and forth to students. So finishing out this thing, I would argue that what we want to get to is asking a different set of questions. And I go back to that statement from I think she was from Hawaii, this president from Hawaii. What I think you guys and us are trying to get to is we want to create a culture where this happens. We're asking a wider set of questions, better set of questions. More people are asking them. They feel empowered to act on the answers. And again, I don't think it's some mythical thing that only Valencia and Florida and a handful of other colleges can do. 10 years ago, Valencia looked like the rest of us. They've doubled their graduation numbers now, by the way, when the enrollment's gone up 40%. It is possible to change this. You look at the 4-year schools, you look at these 2-year schools. It's not going to happen overnight, and there's no silver bullet. But what you see at these colleges is you see a culture that is always asking, what are the barriers for students? What are the things that help them? Identifying with data, and how can we do more or less of that and get them through more? So I'll stop here, and I get to do after dinner. This is grid scheduling. I blame Larry for this. So the last presentation of the day after dinner is about fiscal and costs. So that'll be really energizing, I know, for all of you. I will make it energizing. That's what I'm going to do. So thank you for your time. I'll take questions kind of on a one-off because I think it's dinner time now.